Hello there, I'm Ursa, and I've played Sid Meier's Civilization 7. That's very exciting to say. In this video, I'm going to tell you everything I know about the launch, the game itself, and I'll share my thoughts and opinions as we go along. Need a teaser to get you interested? Well, Civ 7, it's going to have navigable rivers, no builders or workers, the introduction of towns alongside cities, a new 3-age system, cities that build over themselves in layers, leaders and civilizations that have been separated from each other completely, and new to Civ 7, your civilization changes at the end of every era, but your leader does not. Thought that would get your attention? Civ 7 is very different to Civ 6. If change shocks you, prepare yourself. A few things before we get properly started. Firstly, a huge thank you to 2K Games and Firaxis Games, the publisher and developer behind Civilization 7, for flying myself and a larger group of creators and press over to Baltimore, as well as paying for hotels and food whilst we were over in Baltimore. More about my trip to Maryland in a bit, as well as what I saw in Firaxis Studios. Secondly, this video is going to be comprehensive and therefore quite long. If there are any particular burning questions that you need answering, this video will have timestamps that you can use to flick to the areas that interest you most. Third and last, whilst I try and answer all of the questions in the comments of this video as best as I can, there are two better places to go if you want to ask me any questions about either my trip or Civilization 7. My Discord, which has about 19,000 avid Civ 6 fans who will become Civ 7 fans, I'm sure. They're there eager to talk about Civilization 7, and it's a pretty great place to start. Alternatively, I'm going to be doing an Ask Me Anything live stream, which should be going out tomorrow from the time this video goes out, fingers crossed. I'll put up various posts about the timings of that live stream soon, and as many time zones as I can figure out. I also wanted to give you a quick preface to all of the material that I have used to compile this video. It comes from a combination of sources. Official material that has been given to us by 2K and Firaxis, material released to the public via wider social channels. This is probably stuff that you've seen on Reddit or X. Leaked material gathered by the internet, often again seen on Reddit or Discord or X or places like that. First-person material physically gathered by me in Baltimore, listening to presentations by the Firaxis team, and interviewing developers both from Firaxis and 2K in an official capacity. And also first-person material gathered off the record through dinners and general casual social interaction. Now, where I refer to talks given to me by people in an official capacity, I will refer to them by name only if they have given me explicit permission to do so. Otherwise, I am going to retain an element of privacy to protect all of their identities. After all, in my opinion, I'm able to get a lot more accurate and truthful information, you could say, if I'm able to have these sort of off-the-record conversations with people outside of official capacity and channels. I will, however, clarify all of my sources, whether they come from either Firaxis or 2K. There is, of course, a slight difference between the publisher and the developers. Or I'll mention if it was from another third-party source. It was also worth mentioning that when I visited Baltimore and physically got to play Civ 7, like everybody else there, the gameplay we were given was specifically limited to the first age of the game. More on that later. So a lot of the later or even mid-game mechanics that I'm going to speak about today have not been seen by anybody outside of the development channels. All footage and gameplay that you are going to see today also comes with one very large caveat. It may change before launch, but that is plenty of clarification. Let's just get started with the good stuff. The release. Sid Meier's Civilization 7 is currently slated to release on the 11th of February 2025, which is absolutely in line with the leak we saw from the 2K earnings report a couple of weeks ago, which said that it would be Q4 fiscal 2025. There we go. Correct. This isn't the whole picture, however. There is an early access edition slated to release 5 days earlier, on the 6th of February. I'll talk about the different release editions in a moment, but it will be interesting to see how much of an attraction or a turn-off this early access period will prove to be. At the very least, you are likely to see us content creators flooding the market in those first 5 days. The game is set to release on PC via the Steam and Epic's game Game Store, that's on Windows, and also on Linux and Macs, but just via Steam. It's also slated to release on console, on the Xbox Series X and S, the Xbox One, the PlayStation 4 and 5, and the Nintendo Switch. There are also rumors that, let's just say, there was a hypothetical new Nintendo console coming out. I don't know, let's just call it a Switch 2. Civ 7 will probably also appear on that, but that is rumored, to be fair. The people I spoke to at Firaxis would not explicitly confirm that for me, just rumor. Now, this is a very expansive day one release schedule. I am really genuinely pleased that so many people are going to be able to play Civ 7 from day one, regardless of platform you're playing it on, PC or console. One of the major successes of Civilization 6 was its ability to obtain so many players across such a wide player base, and console play made up a substantial part of that player base. It's definitely something that I've read, but I'm sure a lot of people are going to be genuinely thrilled that they will be able to play the game from day one. Rumors of a console release being pushed down the line were quite rife. I also know that a lot of people who play on previous generations of console, the PS4 being a good example, are going to be able to play without having to upgrade their platform. Brilliant. There are, however, slight worries about the ambition of such a large simultaneous launch across so many platforms on day one. For instance, day one patches, which fix the inevitable bugs and errors that happen on launch, that's just something that happens with games these days. They are much harder when you have to patch across multiple different consoles at the same time. Console release also dictates that physical copies of the game often have to be printed weeks, if not months before release. And that can severely limit or complicate last-minute development of the game, especially as you go towards a deadline, or it can impact on last-minute testing and development generally. Though perhaps I'm worrying too much. In 2025, this is the era of downloadable updates across all varieties of platforms, so potentially this won't be as much of a problem as we might have seen previously. Could the development team also find itself stretched too thinly between all of the different types of code and platform, especially on day one, when their attention is likely to be spread the most thin? Would it perhaps be better to stagger the release across multiple platforms to give themselves an easier time of it, to increase stability? It was a hotly debated topic amongst people I spoke to. Now, the people I did speak to at Firaxis were fully acceptant of the size and scale of the challenge of such a large release like this across multiple platforms. And by their own admission, it's by far the most ambitious release schedule Firaxis have ever attempted. When I questioned them, they reassured that this is the largest, most qualified Firaxis team that has ever been deployed on a game by far, and they genuinely believe they are going to be up to task on launch. Personally, my opinion, I have to give them the benefit of the doubt on this. They know a lot more about releasing a game than I do, and if they think they're going to be ready for it, they might be ready for it. I mean, it's going to be a lot of work to do all of that on day one. Is it going to pay off? We will see, but I remain optimistic. Now we're going to talk about the 3-3-3 rule, or the underpinning game design that Firaxis used to build Civ 7, as well as multiple other previous generations of Civilization. Firaxis have made no secret in the past about their design philosophy when it comes to making a new generation of Civilization. It's called the 3-3-3 rule, or the third principle, and it's broken down a little bit like this. When Firaxis comes to making a new edition of Civilization, a new game should have 1/3 of the game lifted almost directly from the previous game to the new one, to provide both a stable player experience from one generation to the next, and also to provide a solid coding foundation to build the new game upon. Makes a lot more sense if the game that you're using worked before. The next third of the game expands and builds upon the mechanisms of the previous generation. Now, this is a good opportunity for the developers to play with features that we may have seen before. These can be given new complexity, new life, or expanded into something more concrete or important than we saw from the previous generation. In some cases, it may also be the expansion of ideas that were in the previous generation but didn't really get a chance to shine. And that leaves the last third of the game. This is the entirely new section of the game. This is the change. This is the new material that makes the new game special. Now, interestingly, when I spoke to a developer at Firaxis, they told me that they believed the third rule for Civ 7 might be a little bit out. They reckoned that the new portion of the game roughly took about 40 to 45% of Civ 7. Broadly, when I have a look at my notes for making this video and I think about the Civ 7 I played, I would broadly agree with this. Now, we'll go into the details of Civ 7 in this video. And don't get me wrong, this very much feels like a Civilization game. If you've played Civ 5 or you've played Civ 6, you will recognize a lot of the content in Civ 7. But there is a whole host of new mechanics and gameplay choices that I've never seen before. Civ 7 feels very different to Civ 6. In fairness, just like Civ 6 felt very different to Civ 5. And because of that, my prediction on the release of a lot of the information coming out about Civ 7 and when the game comes out, I think there's going to be a lot of very heated debate about a lot of the changes that Civ 7 has made, mainly because of the sheer amount of change in Civ 7. It is just a lot of change. Firaxis have not pulled their punches. They have gone in hard, and I can see that dividing initial opinion. Again, just like Civ 6 and in its time, Civ 5 did. So let's talk about some of the lessons the developers learned from Civ 6 that they wanted to bring into Civ 7. Firaxis spoke about performing a sort of post-mortem on Civ 6 and about the things they really wanted to change. In some cases, things that they wanted to address or even correct with Civ 6 when it comes to Civ 7. The main ones that I could gather were wanting to break the experience of the game or the campaign up into chapters, rather than having one continuous game that can easily start to either snowball or give you the feeling that you're hopelessly behind on. Especially in the early game, if you really do feel like you've fallen off a cliff and there's no way back into the game. Separately, they wanted to make sure that the victory conditions were really compelling, and because of that, that the late game is more engaging than it has been in previous Civ generations. Firaxis want to make sure that more of the player base actually finish games, because they've looked at the stats and not many people finish games at all. It's almost staggering, some of the stats that they have. They also wanted to try and dissuade the endless re-rolling of maps in the early game. You know, the restart button that we all like? They don't want you using that. They want to develop an experience that allows more types of playthroughs with more different game styles on more different maps. So basically, you know, the thing that I've been preaching for years about being adaptable and playing everything, turns out the developers agree with me. And because of that, broadly speaking, I can quite honestly say that I empathize and agree with a lot of the points that have been raised there. We have all played games that 100 turns in, they already feel like they're over. Either because you're so far ahead, you've had such a good start that victory from that point onwards is going to be a procession, or because you're so far behind it feels totally hopeless. And we've all, myself included, found ourselves guilty at one point or another of re-rolling and re-rolling and re-rolling maps to get that perfect start for the perfect Civ with the perfect strategy that we always wanted to do. Having a more reliable starting system does feel like a forward step in that regard, and if the game remains engaging all the way through, that's got to feel like a good thing. It also sounds like it might actually help the multiplayer community as well if maps have more reliable starting locations, but that will come with time. And thus, we find ourselves at our first major redesign for Civ 7. New ages and city rebuilding. Ages as we have known them in Civ 6, so we go from ancient to classical to medieval to Renaissance, industrial, modern, atomic, information and future, they have all been scrapped and totally replaced with 3 new ages. And you've actually been able to see them on this graphic the whole time. The first age at the bottom, the age of antiquity. The second age on the left hand side, the age of exploration. And at the top, the final age, the modern age. Now from Civ 7 onwards, ages are much more rigid and much more defined than ever. Every player in the game on the map is locked into the same age. And the only way for ages to progress is for everybody to progress at the same time. They will now effectively serve as chapters, and they are almost entirely separate from each other. You can actually start to think about Civ 7 as being 3 separate games played continuously into one longer campaign. Each age now has its own entirely separate tech and civic tree, more on that a little bit later, and they physically act as hard stopping points for how far a civilization can progress in a single age. My understanding on this is that Firaxis were keen to introduce a little bit more rubber banding in the gameplay mechanics for Civ 7, and this is one way they've gone about doing it. Interestingly, both the tech and civic trees for every age have their own future tech and future civic options. So there are things for you to do if you reach the end of them, but each age absolutely is now rigidly defined. During the presentation in Firaxis Studios, the developer spoke about London in England, the capital, being used as a city that heavily made up the point of reference for the sort of game that Firaxis wanted to design Civ 7 into. That, by the way, did worry me a little bit because I've lived in London and it's rubbish. I would advise that no one ever does. Okay, right. I'm winding people up. Yeah, I'm sure it is a lovely place for some people, but I cannot emphasize this enough. The Firaxis team were fascinated by the way that London had evolved over time. The history is pretty fascinating, to be honest with you. It started out as a Roman settlement, which pretty much was a point of trade and a camp for war for legions to base themselves whilst they fought with the locals. Over time, it established itself into something much bigger, and it became a major English city, eventually the capital city. They showed us how London has been literally rebuilt over the top of itself multiple times over the course of history. Areas that started as military encampments eventually became places for residential housing. Areas of the city dedicated to religious prayer eventually became trading quarters, and large naval dockyards eventually became what is now known as one of the largest financial hubs in the world. And with ages in mind, that core mechanic of cities changing and rebuilding over the top of themselves is a core mechanic for how Civ 7 works. It could not be more fundamental. When a civilization moves from one age to another, districts can be entirely built over. They can be replaced entirely. So when a district is placed on a map, the districts and the buildings within it are no longer placed for the entirety of the game. This means that a city will continue to evolve over time, and the age the world is currently in will hugely change how a city looks, feels, and interacts with the world around it. It also means, because of the layering effect, a district or building you put down at the beginning of the game may actually end up impacting on the things that go on top of it later. Now, there are large benefits and rewards for a civilization that does well in either the Age of Antiquity or Exploration. Once that age is done and the next one begins, civilizations are now effectively fundamentally reset in a way that we haven't seen before. And this is a little bit more of that rubber band effect that I was talking about before. When a new age starts, all civilizations of the game will restart on a much closer level than we've seen before. And on top of that, they now have a new scientific and civic tree to work on, and a whole new city to redesign over the top of the previous one they had built. If we're going to understand that in any more detail, we'll have to talk about how cities are built in Civilization 7, and there are some core mechanics to that, namely urban and rural districts. As you build a city in Civilization 7, you build it by making either rural or urban districts, and you can see both in this picture here. In the top right and the bottom left, you can see some of the rural districts, such as farms, plantations, lumber mills, things that you would normally associate with tile improvements in Civilization 5 or 6. In the bottom left, you can also see a mine. In the center, you can see a large urban sprawl, which represents the urban districts. And here is one of the most fundamental changes of Civ 7. You no longer need builders or workers to grow out any of the improvements in a city. As the city grows, it makes for itself instantaneously urban and rural districts. That's right, there are no builders or workers in Civilization 7. When a city gains population, it instantaneously gains the ability to improve one tile in its surrounding area. Again, if we look at this picture, when this city grew a population, it could have picked one of these resources in the top right and instantaneously put a farm down. Think about it like this. Every time you get a population in a city, you get one rural district or a tile improvement. Urban districts do not get affected by population. Instead, they are now what house all of the buildings within a city, things like your granary, your monument. They are not held within the city center anymore. When you make a building, either by using production or gold, it instantaneously creates an urban district to sit in. So again, with my very uneducated eye, eye, when I look at this picture, you can see what is probably a palace in the middle, then a granary has been put on the tile below it, still within an urban centre, or an urban district to use the terminology correctly, but no longer solely in the city centre. Each urban district contains 2 slots for buildings. Each one can take 2, and they can be matched and paired exactly how you like. You can have a bunch of urban districts that have 1 building in, or you can fill them up 2 by 2 by 2 by 2. It's your choice, and there is no set rule as to what building can go with another. Additionally, the city centre itself can take 1 more building. It starts with a palace, which counts as a building in itself, but you could put the monument in there, or the altar, or the granary. It's up to you. Now, buildings have a variety of benefits, and some can have multiple benefits. So for instance, again, looking at this picture, the granary. When I played the game, the granary gave a set amount of food per turn for your city, so it helps it to grow. But just by having it in your city, it also provided an extra +1 food for all of the farmable resources in your land, such as farms, pastures, camps, that sort of thing. Had 2 different bonuses. Some buildings also have adjacency bonuses, a little bit like we've seen in Civ 6 before. So from memory, some of the scientific and cultural buildings also gained adjacency from being next to other urban districts, or wonders, or certain improvements or resources. And the fun thing about this is that every building has a slightly different criteria as to the things that make it better. So looking again at this picture, there's actually a lot going on here in terms of the optimization of how the perfect city works. You need to make sure that you're pairing your buildings properly. Are you going to have 2 buildings in the same urban district to have exactly the same adjacencies so that they are potently mixed? Or are you going to put them so that they have different adjacencies so that the city is a little bit more nebulous? Firaxis and the development team spoke frequently about a phrase which really stuck with me: depth, not complexity. And this kind of really sums it up. Actually playing this system first time in my first game, it was incredibly easy just to spam things onto the map, and it just sort of worked. But the fine detail, the fine tactics of exactly how to optimize things with each other, that was actually incredibly complex. So it's going to be an interesting different mechanism to get your head around, I think. A little bit more terminology for you. If we take an urban district and it has 2 separate buildings in it, it becomes a quarter. Now, the exact fundamentals of what a quarter is compared to a district were lost a little bit on me, and I think it comes into the game a little bit later. But one thing we did see is that a lot of civilizations have a secret, unique quarter. So for instance, if I give you a little bit of story from the gameplay that myself and another content creator, Civs, had when we played Civilization 7. I played Rome and he played Egypt. When we were playing, one of the Firaxis devs, also Civ Give contestant and general legend of the game, Carl Harrison, he hinted to us that we should take the 2 unique buildings for our civilizations and put them in the same district. We both did, because, you know, we're pro players, and we were both rewarded with a secret unique quarter for our civilization. I think the Roman one from memory was the Hippodrome, and it gave me all kinds of bonuses to that city depending on what cards I was using in my government. It was really cool. Civs did, and I think the Egyptian one was something like the Necropolis. I didn't really see what it did. I'm sure he'll give more detail on that. But it did get me thinking, there's actually a lot of synergy in this game that is more complex than anything we've seen in Civ 5 and 6 before. It was very cool. When the age ends and the new one begins, every urban district is effectively reset, with new building slots that can then be rebuilt over. This way, a city effectively evolves with time, and a choice you made in the early game may not be one you make in the later game. For instance, you might have had a district that was gaining you military production, like an encampment building of some kind. You might instead choose in the Age of Exploration to put a scientific building there, or a trade building, depending on how your view of the game and your victory condition changes with time. You could probably at the end of the game even change it to culture. Now, personally, this was one of the things that really excited me the most of what I saw with Civ 7, the complexity and diversity of city building. I don't know if you played like me, but when I played Civ 6, I commonly found myself spamming the same district over and over again with the same adjacencies and the same patterns. We all know, for instance, on a naval game, to put down a harbour and then campus and then harbour, then campus, then harbour, then campus, and throw in the occasion occasional industrial zone, but that's all you end up doing. So this change between having more complex and diverse districts, there are no campuses, commercial hubs, encampments. I might stress that. I cannot stress that enough. The district is literally made up of the buildings you put inside it. So that change I do find very interesting. Whether it will actually end up breaking that gameplay loop, or whether instead it becomes a question of every city gets a granary, every city gets an altar, and there are other metas that emerge that end up replacing that loop, well, that's another question, and is one that did get me thinking. I just want to play more of the game, really. That's kind of what I'm saying. Certainly, when I asked this to the development team at Firaxis, they were keen to stress that the main thing they were trying to stop was pointless or mindless city spamming, aka just throwing the same districts down over and over and over again. The example they gave was everyone's love of industrial zones, which does match up with a lot of people's opinion of Civ 6, right? Industrial zones, if you don't have one in a city, you're kind of losing something. If you don't have something giving you a trade route in a city, you're kind of losing something. They want to encourage genuine, diverse city growth, with different cities having different specialties and doing different things for your empire. We'll see if they manage that. So let's get stuck into some of the more interesting changes with Civ 7 with how cities work. Population, border growth, and the absence of builders and workers, which, by the way, is a topic that I think is probably going to be very heavily debated. Just like in previous editions of Civ, a city in Civilization 7 begins with one population. Food is still the yield that causes the city to grow. It has effectively a bucket that needs filling, and when that bucket is full, it gains a population. So far, so similar. That is where the differences really begin to start, however, because when a city gains population, and as before, we discussed when a city gains a population, you improve one tile, thus creating one rural district, or like a tile improvement in a city. A couple of things happen. Firstly, that improvement gains any resources on that tile, and it also culture bombs around the tile, claiming land for you. So there is no such thing anymore as gold buying tiles or using culture to grow the borders of your city. The borders grow via culture bombs that you put down based on population and the improvements that you choose. That's a bit of a difference. So for instance, we're currently looking at a city that has a granary on the top left tile. That's why there's an urban district on that tile. The city has reached 2 population and can now improve a tile around it. You are presented with a screen like this that offers you the choice to put an improvement down on any tile that you own in the city. You can see you can't put a rural district on the top left-hand tile because that's where the granary is. But any of the other tiles work. We have 4 options for a lumber mill, and in the bottom left, the option to put down what I think is a fishery. So the player selects that tile to turn into a rural district, and bam, a fishing district has now been placed on that tile, and as you can see, all of the tiles around it have been culture bombed. This shot's really cool, by the way, because it shows the navigable river. Do you see this is a navigable river? Because it goes through the middle of tiles. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Any owned tile in a city that isn't already an urban district can be turned into a rural district or improved. So because of this, you can entirely pick the direction that your borders grow in. And let me tell you from experience, cities can grow very, very quickly if you continue to pick tiles on the edge of your borders. It is like playing Gaul from Civ 6. It has that similar sort of like bump, bump, bump feel of grabbing as much tile as you want. It gives you a lot of flexibility in tactics. So for instance, you can have a look at the map and say, there are some resources that I want to gain. I'm just going to beeline towards them and claim them as quickly as I can. Or you could say, actually, defensively, it's really important that I control all of this land. I better just make sure that I grow in that direction. Or you can be a real jerk and settle next to somebody and then steal all their land before they can. It's just another thing to troll people with. Actually, a subtle difference to observe here. The difference between rural and urban districts is that urban districts have to be adjacent to another urban district. So they actually grow from the middle of a city and go out. They can look really stringy and silly, but they have to all be next to each other. Rural districts can be anywhere in your land. According to the Firaxis dev team, that was to give cities more of a natural urban sprawl rather than in Civilization 6, where districts can just be put wherever you want. You know, you can have a city center and then none of the other districts are anywhere near. They wanted to stop that sort of feel to it. You'll notice again in all of that, not just the putting of buildings down, but also the improving of tiles. It's all linked to what a city builds, it's linked to your gold, and it's linked to the population of a city. There are no such thing as builders or workers in the game anymore. And all of this gameplay loop, this is why I think it's going to be one of the most keenly debated and discussed areas of the game game of Civ 7 that we've seen so far. The reason is that a lot of the fundamental civilization gameplay loops that we're used to have been altered forever. First, the positives. I like this system because it's incredibly intuitive and it's incredibly responsive to what the player wants to do. I'm all for cities acting and feeling like they are doing what you want them to do. Now, don't get me wrong, gold purchasing borders has always been something a player can do in Civilization 5 and 6. Trust me, I have lost my gold balance doing that in more games than I want to admit. It's addictive, it's annoying. But one thing you could never control or fully control was the culture growth of borders. You get a certain amount of culture per turn in Civ 5 and Civ 6 and your borders naturally expand, randomly and sometimes really annoyingly. That system has now gone, and I don't think I'll be mourning that system at all. In the mid to late game, we are also going to be free of some of the more annoying gameplay loops that have plagued generations of Civ for a while. In Civ 5, we were all familiar with the idea of making far too many workers and then just pressing automate and never looking at them again. In Civ 6, there was a little bit of a running joke, which is, should you build a builder? Yes, the answer is probably you should build a builder. They were so fundamentally intrinsic in the gameplay loop that their importance was almost too high. Like, they are integral to good play. If you don't use builders, you're doing it wrong. And so being free of that sort of thinking, I think is a really good thing. The chopping or harvesting of resources or terrain features is now entirely gone as well. You can actually see on this map, we have woods in this city. You can't remove them with builders or workers anymore. When you improve that tile, it makes a lumber mill and it stays on the map forever. If you put an urban district on a wood, it stays there on the map. Again, why do I think this is a good thing? The days of endlessly clearing an entire map of all stone, all wood, and all rainforest has now gone. That is no longer a meta that needs to be strictly followed. Chop, 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 chop. I think we're going to see a city design that requires a lot more management of the map and a lot more adapting to the terrain that you have around you. Certainly in my Rome game, I had enough wood and enough coast around me to really hamper what I thought was a natural growth of the city, and it actually pushed Rome, the capital city in my empire, in a totally different and random direction I didn't expect the game to go in. I really enjoyed that. I also got the feeling that the new players or people coming into Civilization 7 fresh, like myself from this point, this system was incredibly intuitive and very easy to get your head around within a few minutes. So I think we might see Civ 7 being one of the more approachable games in the series so far. There are some downsides, however, that we should probably address. A lot of the other creators that I spoke to whilst we were in Baltimore were of the opinion that the loss of builders and workers from the early game fundamentally changed the game in a big way and took away one of the most important early game decisions there is. Do I make a builder, and which tiles do I improve and work? And to be honest, I can understand that argument. How many builders do you make? Where in the build queue do you put them? Which charges do you put where? Do you attack your neighbors or your adjacent city-states to steal their builders? Is it worth it? All of that is now gone from the game. And almost entirely, that is all early game thinking. Are we going to have a poorer early game because of the loss of this interaction or not? Another comment, and one I kind of agree with, is that a lot of the choice of the map seems to have gone in the other direction now. When you have builders, especially in Civ 6, and especially if you have a couple of unique improvements or city-states giving you access to unique improvements, there were often multiple things that you could put on the same tile. So for instance, you're playing a game of Civilization 6 and you're playing Scythia. You have a blank plains tile. What are you going to put on it? Do you put a farm, or do you put a kurgan, your unique improvement, an alcazar that you took from Granada, or maybe even a cathedral that you took from Armagh? There's a hill with some woods on it. Do you just put a lumber mill on, or do you remove the wood and put a mine on it, or do you remove the wood and put a farm on it? There's a lot of different options available to you. In the Civilization 7 that we played, every tile has only one thing that you can put on it. So again, looking at this example, these wood tiles on the right hand side of Wasset, the only urban district you could build on them was a lumber mill. You had no choice to remove them and put, say, a farm down. Hills you could only put mines on. Coast you could only put fishing ports, and it was a similar sort of thing. There wasn't actually a lot of choice. Now the big disclaimer to that is we were only playing the Antiquity Age, the first of 3 ages. I don't know if that decision making gets more complicated later in the game. But if there isn't choice and you only have one thing that you can build on each tile, well, rural districts in my head might feel like a step in the backwards direction if they're looking for more of a complicated city experience. The loss of population control was also fiercely debated as well. Now, in Civilization 5 and 6, we are used to the idea that for every population in a city, you work one tile, and which tile you work determines the yields of that city. Do you work the 3-1 tile at the beginning of the game, or the 1-3 tile? Is a 2 food, 1 production, 1 gold tile better than a 3 food tile? Well, it's for you to decide, and you allocate where your populations are, including specialists. In Civilization 7, that system doesn't exist because the city automatically works every single tile in its borders and collects all of the yields from all of the tiles in its borders. Now, unfortunately, all of the shots that I've been given to show you, none of them show the yields of the tiles, which is a little bit unfortunate, but I can give you a little bit of a hint at what they look like by looking at a previous screen. You can see down at the bottom, the marsh tile gives 2 food, you've got the coast tile giving 1 food, 1 gold. So all of these yields are being collected and are being put into that asset pool in the top left. So this city currently has 5 food, 5 production, 5 happiness. You no longer get to choose where your population works, you just get the yield. So is that again a backward step in terms of being able to optimize and strategically plan the early game in your cities? I mean, don't get me wrong, on turn 200, no one can be bothered to really manage their citizens anymore. But early game, it was important. Early game, it was actually kind of a core experience of Civ. The only thing that population does in Civilization 7 is determine how many rural districts you have, how many improved tiles that you're working. It is a much simpler system. Is it a better one? I think that's going to be debated. I will say this though, I did enjoy it. So let's talk about another core mechanic now. Settling cities, towns, and possibly the death of wide play. Now, one of the most hotly contested debates in Civ 5 was the debate of wide versus tall. And if you don't know what that means, effectively it was settling lots of cities or having fewer cities that generally had more population and were more fleshed out. Now, that especially became true with the release of the Brave New World DLC. In that, a malus, a physical negative percentage, was put on the player in science and culture for every city they owned outside of the capital. So the more cities you had, the wider the penalty became. This meant that in Civ 5, cities had to count. Otherwise, it didn't matter how much your science and culture was. If you had a ton of cities, you would never be able to keep up with the more efficient tall empires. It meant that civilizations could have 3, 4, or even 5 cities and keep up with those with 25 cities. Culture trees such as tradition or liberty, well, they also fueled that debate. What was the best option? A 1-city challenge? 4 cities in order to get the most out of tradition? Or as many cities as you could get with liberty? What would your happiness allow? What malus was worth taking? That was the eternal question in Civ 5. And there was no fixed answer. That was kind of the beauty of it. Civ 6 effectively ended that discussion entirely because there was a correct answer. And that was to go wide, to have as many cities as you possibly could. It was clearly the best playstyle. It wasn't even close. Sure, there was a malus in Civ 6 for the number of cities that you had in the form of amenities. The problem is that negative amenities just weren't punishing enough. They were easily overcome. The percentage to city yields that you got was so small that what was the better option between having 10 cities and 50 cities? It was 50 cities. And you know what was even better than that? 100 cities. Yes, all of the cities was always the correct answer. And it was interesting, when I spoke to the developers at Firaxis, they identified that as one of the major problems they wanted to correct going from Civ 6 into Civ 7. They wished for an end to endless wide play, which is quite encouraging. And so we come to Civ 7, where they have addressed this in the form of a settlement cap. At the start of the game, most civilizations start with a settlement cap of 3, and you can see that in this screenshot here in the top left-hand corner. If you own more than 3 settlements, or you go above that settlement cap, globally, across your empire, your cities start to take a -5 happiness penalty per city or settlement that you own. Yep, happiness as a mechanic is back in Civ 7. You can again see the global happiness in the top left-hand corner. And that negative malus actually stacks for every city that you go above that threshold. So in this particular circumstance, if we have a settlement cap of 3 and we had 6 settlements, we would have 3 over the cap, and every single city or settlement would have -15. Now there is a slight caveat to this, because the gameplay demo that we were given, I didn't really get far enough into the game to really truly explore the impacts of negative happiness happiness, but from what I could tell using mechanics available to me at the gameplay demo, it appears like it is a combination of Civ 6 and Civ 5 mechanics. Namely, your cities appear to suffer a negative percentage reduction to growth, yields, production generally, a bit of everything. The Firaxis developers actually did hint at the fact that that happiness penalty could cause cities to revolt permanently. Again, I didn't get to test that mechanic. But what we do know is that that mechanic is much stronger in Civ 7 than it was in Civ 6, so we will see more of a Civ 5 wide versus tall debate. Now, certain civilizations start with a smaller or larger settlement cap than others, and as you progress through the game and you go through the tech and civic trees, you expand that cap further. As you go into the second or third age, again, it gets wider and wider and wider. So your civilizations towards the end of the game will look a lot wider than your civilization at the beginning of the game. That is intended as a progression mechanic. As an example, these aren't my screenshots, these are just screenshots provided to me, but I played Rome in my game. I started with a settlement cap of 3, and by about turn 135, I had 7 settlement cap. I can't remember exactly how I got my settlement cap that higher, but I think again, it was a combination of the tech and civic trees, namely the civic tree. To my knowledge, outside of the civic and tech trees, there is a combination of wonders, civilizations, leaders, and other things you can pick up that again, keep expanding that cap. So there will certainly be playstyles that encourage having lots and lots and lots of settlements. Rome, as an example, worked off having more settlements. That was kind of their whole deal. Now, the eagle-eared among you will have noticed I've been very particularly using my choice of words when talking about settlements, because we get to another big change in Civ 7, the introduction of towns alongside cities. Now, when I look at the top left-hand corner of the screen, you'll see 3 of 3. That means I own 3 settlements, but it does not mean that I own 3 cities. This screenshot is a little bit funny because you can't quite see the detail, but in the top right-hand corner, that's where Rome is. And that is the starting capital. Your initial starting settler creates a capital, and that automatically is a city. What is a city? Well, cities are broadly what we are used to seeing in Civilization 5 and 6. As you go through the game, however, all future settlers do not create cities. You can actually see 2 new settlements that have been put down, Neapolis and Ravenna. These are both towns, and towns are what you get when you settle going forward. Towns look, smell, and feel like cities to an extent, but they have a totally different gameplay mechanic than cities do. A city is a settlement that you have full control over. This screenshot shows just a little bit more. A city is a settlement that you have effectively a production queue for. It uses the hammers, the production, to make buildings or units within it, again, very much like we've seen before. You can also use gold in cities, just like production, and they insta-buy things still. In fact, in Civ 7, it's a little bit more interesting, because if you insta-buy a building in a city, it creates the urban district immediately. So yes, in Civ 7, you can use gold to instantly buy districts. That's a fun change. I do like that change. And because you have full control of them, just like in this screenshot of Rome, you can see that cities tend to get a little bit bigger and they're a little bit more complicated, especially if it's your capital city. That's the one you've been working on for some time. Towns are a little bit different. Towns are more hands-off. They do not have a production queue. You cannot use production in them to build anything. When they are initially founded, towns start off as a default growth town, and because of that, they get a bonus to growth. Population in them grows much faster than in a regular city, so you will see population of towns go whoa. They do this by, just like cities, counting up all the food in the tiles around them and absorbing it into population. But they also do a second thing with food. For every food they pick up, they create a copy, a duplicate of that food, and that food is then sent back to your cities. So owning a town increases the amount of food your city receives. There is a symbiosis between the two that is an incredibly fundamental mechanic in Civ 7. From my experience, the more towns you have and the more food they each produce, the faster your cities grow, and that really does get faster quicker. Your capital can grow incredibly fast if you own a lot of towns. In my playtest, I had 1 city and at one point 6 towns, and my capital grew very, very quickly. And this appeared to be a deliberate mechanic. When I spoke to the Firaxis developers about this, they actually said that after a certain point, city growth is almost impossible without towns feeding into them, especially when you get to about 20 to 25 population population. If you don't have a lot of very well-developed towns feeding your city, it will just stop growing. A city needs outside help. It's supposed to reflect that gameplay mechanic. A city cannot produce its own food. It needs those more arable towns around it, shipping in commerce and produce to actually get them to expand. Now, that's not to say that that's the only thing that towns do. They still do have a little bit of autonomy. As towns gain population, just like the cities, they gain rural districts, aka those improvements we spoke about earlier: camps, pastures, farms, plantations. So in this particular screenshot, you can see Neapolis seems to have put a farm down on the tile to the top left, and Ravenna appears to have put down what might be a plantation on the top right. Actually, they could both be farms. Difficult to see without we could have used the resource icons on this map, but never mind. And just like the cities, you can see the tiles are culture bombed around them, so they grow in a very similar way that cities do, and you choose how and where they grow. The major difference is that they do not have a build queue. Production in towns does nothing. Well, not quite. Instead, all of the production that a town makes is converted into straight gold per turn. So if you build a mine in a city, you will give that city production and it will work on its build queue. If you put a mine in a town, it produces gold, and that gold goes into your empire total that you can see in the top left-hand side of the screen. So just like with food, the more towns you have and the more improved they are, the more gold per turn your nation will make overall. And most interestingly, you can still gold purchase buildings into your towns. You can still put things like granaries, altars, libraries, workshops, all of these buildings that you're used to seeing in your cities. They can be put in towns, but you just need to use them using a more inefficient gold purchase system. Now, I get that distinction without playing the game can seem a little bit complicated, so let me just try it again in a more simple form. Cities have a build queue. Production is used to build things in a city. A town only makes gold and has no build queue. However, gold as a resource can be used to purchase anything, anywhere you want. So in Civ 7, gold as a resource is going to be much more versatile and usable as a resource compared to other games of Civilization we've seen before. It really is the resource that can be spent anywhere. So does that mean production is less valuable? No, that traditional 4-to-1 ratio of production being 4 times as useful building something in a city compared to the value of it in gold, that still remains. So from my playtest, when you got a city with a lot of production, it could churn things out very quickly, and you would need a lot of gold to replicate that. But equally, once you had 5 or 6 towns firing and producing gold, your empire made a lot of it, and that gold resource became very useful to just target things and purchase stuff in instantaneously. Towns have been described as being as close to a vassal city that we've seen since Civilization 5. It's kind of the closest analogy that I can bring to what towns play like. They are semi-autonomous, but as a player, I didn't feel like they were so far out of my control that they weren't a lot of fun. Now again, as you can see in this screenshot, Rome currently owns 1 city and 2 towns, and all of them count towards that settler cap. My understanding is that there is no point in not settling up to your settlement cap. It definitely seems like if you've got space for 3 settlements, you should have 3 settlements. So there is a little bit of a meta playing there. If you've got a cap of 9, you should have 9. There seem to be absolutely no positive to not settling up to your cap. It's also worth pointing out that if you conquer an enemy city or town, it always becomes a town for you. Not that in my playtest I was doing conquering because I played Rome and had legions and I'm Ursa and I'm a violent dictator when it comes to these games. Not at all. Yes, I did a lot of fighting in my playtest. I don't know what you expect from me. What did you expect from me? So do they stay as towns for the entire game? No. 2 things happen. When a town gets to 7 population, you are presented with a choice. You can either retain the town as a growth town, which basically has a large percentage to growth of that town and the population will rise and rise and rise really quickly. Or you can specialize it into a specialist town. Now, I don't remember all of them off the top of my head, but they were definitely things like mining towns, fishing towns, stuff that plays on the map and different types of improvements. If you specialize a town like this, it loses its growth bonus, so it stops picking up population anywhere near as quickly as it did before. But the yields that it produces that are then converted to gold, and for instance, the food that it produces and sends to your city, if you specialize it as a farming town, well, that drastically increases. So you do want want to push your towns up to 7 population and then think about whether or not you want to keep growing it or specialize it to give your empire more powerful yields in whatever you are gunning for. From my playtesting, there appeared to be about 4 or 5 different types of specialist towns, but they did seem like they were quite versatile and interesting, and it gave an element of interest to the map. Depending on where a town was on the map, the specialism for it could be totally different. So I am positively encouraged by that particular style of play. It seemed like a good mechanic to me. You can also pay a fixed sum of gold to convert your town into a city. Now, the large chunk of gold, I don't remember the exact mechanics for it, but it starts quite high. It's like 600-700 gold. But for every population a town has, that gold cost comes down and down and down and down. So the larger a town is, the easier it is to turn it into a city. Hence why sometimes keeping it as a town and focusing it on growth for a long period of time can make a city really quickly. However, the more cities you have, the more expensive that conversion is. So if you're converting your first town into a city, it's really cheap. Your 5th town into a city, that's more expensive. It was also well worth pointing out that, and I did this in the playtest, I converted one of my towns to a city, so I had 2 cities. That lowered the amount of food and gold that towns were sending my cities because I had 1 less town effectively. But it also split the amount of food my original capital was getting in half because the food that the towns were making were then dividing themselves into 2 cities. So when we talk about wide and tall, I think Civ 7 is going to be more of a conversation of how many cities do I have compared to towns? Do I just have 1 city the entire game, receiving all of the food from my entire empire and becoming astronomically big? Or do I have multiple smaller cities that have less food but all have production queues and are all kicking out lots of goods? Time will tell as to which strategies are better, and I don't know how later ages are going to affect that conversation. We'll see how it goes. The only gameplay loops that I were picking up on were that you wanted as many towns as you could to make sure you had good gold income, but gold was only so useful. You wanted a lot of it. But converting a town into a city and receiving that 4-to-1 more efficient production, having a lot of cities did produce you a lot of stuff, especially when I had 2 cities both producing legions every other turn. It made me quite a big army very quickly. You can also see from this particular screenshot, it's not just Rome. Any settlement that is settled within a certain radius of another settlement instantly has roads built to it. There is no such thing anymore as building roads. They automatically spawn, and you don't have to be Rome to do it. All civilizations get immediately built roads between their settlements. Hallelujah. Yeah, seriously, I think every single content creator I spoke to, they all liked that change, and I know I did. Instant road building leads to the next topic, trade and resources. A city that improves a resource such as horses, iron, silver, spices, silk, gains an improved yield as normal from that tile, as we've seen in previous versions of Civ before. A copy of that resource is then added to your empire-wide resource pool. Some resources apply to your entire empire. For instance, for every copy of horse or iron you seem to gain, you were given a production and combat bonus for melee and cavalry units produced throughout your empire. Take that with a pinch of salt. In fact, take a lot of what I'm saying about resources with a pinch of salt because I don't have any pictures to show you. It's quite a new system that they have just implemented into the game, and I don't remember the exact bonuses. But what I can tell you is that owning horses, for instance, or iron, didn't seem to be a necessary prerequisite to actually being able to build units such as swordsmen or horsemen like we've seen previously before. What it instead does is make you build those units faster, and it gives those units a little bit more combat power. So, for instance, when we compare it to Civ 6, where you needed 20 horses on standard speed to make a horseman, on Civ 7, as long as you've got the tech to build the horseman, you can. But if you have horses, you get a percentage bonus to production, and they start with a little bit more combat potential. Some resources instead apply to a single settlement, a town or a city. These seem to be more of your bonus and luxury resources, things like wine, silk, silver, ivory. These are physically allocated to a town or city via a economic lens or a screen where you had everything pulled on the left-hand side, which I realize on this camera is this side. So you had almost like a bucket of resources, and then you pluck them and pop them so that you allocate them to cities or towns. Depending on the resource, they give you a set bonus. Some, for instance, gave production, some gave happiness, some gave science, some gave food, some gave culture. Most towns seem to only have one slot for resource. So if you had, say, 7 resources and only 3 towns, you've got to pick and choose which ones you're using and in which towns. Cities, however, seem to have more slots for resources, and you were able to improve on them by building things like markets, which gave you more space. There was also a resource called camels, which if you allocated it to a settlement, gave that settlement 2 more slots, and they stacked. We were all very excited. Spiffing Brit was particularly excited about that one because he reckoned you could almost infinitely increase the amount of slots in a settlement. I don't know if they'll keep that one, but certainly that seemed to be how they were doing it till that point. It's worth also noting that it appears that resources now stack like we haven't seen before. So in my game, I think it was wine I had in my nation that was giving a city a large culture bonus. I was able to stack multiple copies of wine in the same city, and the culture of that city was just getting higher and higher and higher. So collecting large amounts of resources and focusing them into particular cities or towns, that appears to be very much a intended mechanic now. You'll also note that I've just been using the word resource, and that's because there is now no separation between bonus, luxury, and strategic resources. Resources are all improved and used in exactly the same way. The only difference I can really see is that some resources are empire-wide, some tend to be more for military, and others appear to have more luxury components. So maybe you've still got a loose definition of strategic luxury bonus, but there isn't such a strong distinction anymore. Certainly the term appears to just now be resource. I also hinted to it before with the previous screenshot. Settlements all now have roads interconnecting them by automatic default, and that means traders no longer make roads. And I can go one further than that and say traders are not a thing in Civ 7. Trade routes as we know them have gone. Instead of traders, we now have merchants added to the game as civilian units. A merchant is a physical civilian unit that sits on the map and has a movement speed. You take the merchant and you physically walk it into an enemy or AI or enemy. It goes to show that I look at the enemy, I've said it again, civilizations as being enemies. I have a very aggressive brain in Civ. I'm realizing this is a problem now. Merchants can walk into neighboring settlements, and when they arrive in the city center, can create a trade route. A trade route does 2 things, one for you and one for the city that the trade route has been set up in. You get a copy, a brand new copy that doesn't affect the enemy or AI in any way, of every resource that settlement has improved. So for instance, if you take your merchant and you put it into a very large AI capital, you get a lot of resources that then get added to your pool. You can then use those resources as you would like and allocate them as if you would improve them yourself. For every resource that you have cloned in this way, the city that you have put your merchant in then gets gold per turn. So they get a benefit as well. So what I was seeing was there was this sort of double-edged mechanic. You want to improve as many resources as you can. If your city has a bunch of improved resources, it contributes a lot of yield and a lot of resources into your empire. But if you make your city really, really attractive, you find that a lot of people send their merchants into your city and they get clones of all of the resources you've made, so you power up people as you do it. But the more attractive your city is for merchants, the more gold per turn it makes from endless trade routes. So you do actually want your city to become a trade hub, because the gold per turn it gives you if people are trading with you is massive. Trade routes are also not capped in number like we have seen in Civilization 5 and 6 before, where there is effectively a trade route cap for an empire. In Civilization 5, the number of trade routes you had were capped to effectively the tech tree, with a couple of wonders like Petra and Colossus giving you more trade routes. In Civ 6, it appeared that you got 1 trade route in the game, and then for every market or lighthouse you built, you got more trade routes, so you had to build hubs to produce them. In Civ 7, it appears that you are able to set up 1 trade route with every single other civilization you have met, and you can improve the number of trade routes you can set up by making diplomatic pacts such as trade deals. A trade deal might give you 2 more slots for trade routes. So unlike in previous Civilization games, it appears like exploring the map and meeting civilizations, that's what increases the number of trade routes you can have, a little bit like Portugal in Civ 6. Civics, but also you were encouraged to make diplomatic agreements with other civilizations in order to increase the amount of trade routes you're producing. So overall, trade has been entirely overhauled in Civilization, and looking back on it, my take on this is actually overwhelmingly positive. I really liked the ability to mix and match the resources from my empire pool into the cities and towns that I wanted. It allowed me to specialize differently at different points in the game depending on what was happening. So at one point I was invaded and I was able to move a bunch of resources into Rome, my capital city, to up the production of that city considerably. Later in the game, when it was more peaceful, I gave myself a little bit of a cycle. I set up some trade routes to other civilizations and I gained multiple copies of resources that increased the science of Rome by a large amount. So I was able just to accelerate through the tech tree. I really liked that system and I think there's a lot of positive there. One little thing I would say is that moving a merchant from your city into an opponent city in order to set up the trade route, that was a very clunky process, and I think the reason we're not seeing a lot of screenshots from trade at the moment is because the user interface was incredibly clunky. However, the development team at Firaxis, whenever we spoke to them about trade, they knew that, and I think this is one of the systems that was fresh into the game that needs a lot of overhauling, especially the user interface. So I wouldn't be surprised if it changes just a little bit between what you're seeing now and what we see in the released game. The one thing I really did like though was the encouragement that you want people to send you trade routes. Now in Civ 5 and Civ 6 there was very limited reason to want people to trade with you. In Civ 5 there were a couple of buildings and wonders that gave you a little bit of gold per turn if people sent trade routes to your city, and in Civ 6 there were a couple of civilization abilities but also cards like Wisselbanken and Democracy that gave the person that you were sending a trade route to yields as well as you. But broadly speaking, in Civ 5 and Civ 6, if you send a trade route, you get the benefit, and say my city has 17 trade routes from me opponents coming into it, well, big whoop, what does that actually do? In Civ 7, if someone sends you a trade route, you get gold per turn. So you want to become a trading hub. I could see in a game, especially later into the game, if somebody has sent you 17 or 18 trade routes into a city, you could be getting 100 gold per turn from that. You can physically create trading hubs by making a city really attractive and filling it with very lovely resources. I think Civilization has been crying out for that sort of two-way trade system for some time, and this is a really good step for that. It also really encouraged you to actually go out and explore the world. Ultimately, if there are 7 civilizations on a map and you haven't met 3 of them, that's 3 civilizations worth of trade routes that you are not setting up that will benefit you. So again, it's another way of encouraging a player to really go out, send out scouts, send out galleys, and interact with the world a little bit more. I could also see a new mechanic that we haven't really seen before, which would be sending merchants out with your scouting units, with your scouts, with your galleys, with your caravels. Because as you discover new civilizations, you want to send them trade routes pretty much as soon as you can. Because say for instance, I'm wandering around the map and I see a city like you can see on screen now, a 19 population mega city with a bunch of resources in it. Well, suddenly a trade route is going to look incredibly good. So very much is something that I would want to do. Well, talking about the map, this is something again that's changed quite a lot in Civilization 7. One of the first big changes that I have mentioned before is the introduction of navigable rivers. Now in the screenshot on the map at the moment, you can see the 2 different types of rivers that are now in the game. On the top, you have what we would be determining as a regular river. Rivers now go through the middle of tiles rather than the edges of them, but normal rivers, well, they change the yields on the tiles a little bit, they change the improvements, but generally speaking, they're sources of fresh water and they might give very regular bonuses and penalties that we have seen in Civilization thus far. Combat penalties for defending or trying to attack across them, freshwater improvements that can be put down, they're just a little bit of fluff on the map. The river at the bottom of the map is a navigable river. Now this is a thick river that from the start of the game, units can transverse. So before you even unlock shipbuilding or ship making or whatever it is that causes units to be able to embark into coast tiles that you can see around the edges of this continent, navigable rivers can still be traveled up and down. So it's a really good way of moving through the map before you actually get a lot of shipbuilding technology. More importantly, naval units can also move up and down these tiles. So you could move a galley from this lake on the left-hand side into the coast on the right-hand side. That means if you settle a city next to a navigable river, yep, the enemy can send a navy up the river to come and pillage or attack attack your city. Yep, that's right. We could see a game where Viking raiders physically move up rivers to go and attack very large inland cities. We may actually finally have a game that does that. Navigable rivers. This must be one of the most requested things that I've seen the community continually ask for. It is in the game. Let's see how they work. Now again, this picture is quite interesting because this is Egypt. Some civilizations receive large bonuses for navigable rivers, and Egypt is one of those. I don't know exactly what their bonuses are, but the more navigable rivers you have, the stronger Egypt gets. Oh, there you go. I found it. Egypt gets +1 production for navigable rivers. So you can see there's going to be a lot of different civilizations that have different bonuses for different areas of the map. They're going to be an integral part of the game going forward. The other thing that I want to have a little conversation about is the graphics of Civ 7. We have already seen that the art style in Civ 7, I think, is somewhere between Civilization 5 and Civilization 6. There is a lot more realism in this game, which is more towards the lens of Civ 5. But the graphics have been brought up to date into 2024-2025 style graphics, and the game is a lot brighter than we've seen Civilization 5 be before. So it is somewhere in the middle, and I quite like it. What I will say is a lot of the screenshots and a lot of the gameplay that you will be seeing as part of these gameplay reveals and a lot of the asset packs we have been given, they don't appear to be working at full graphical capacity. When I was in Firaxis Studios and I played the gameplay, we saw the game running in 4K. Civ 7 actually has been programmed to run fully at 4K quality graphics. It looked stunning. I cannot tell you how pretty the game was, right to the point where if you zoom right in on the map, the detail of the models, the lighting, the ray tracing, it was stunning. Honestly, we've seen a lot of 4X games recently, I'm not going to point names, but you know the ones I'm talking about, that have had some very questionable graphics. Civ 7 running at full capacity was beautiful. Now, I don't know why, but a lot of the asset packs we've been given and a lot of the screenshots that you're going to be looking at, they do not reflect the quality of the graphics. And I think there's probably two reasons for this. Firstly, they probably didn't, for whatever reason, want to release the full graphics at the beginning of the release. I don't know why. And secondly, I imagine a lot of the console ports, especially if you're playing on things like PlayStation 4, Switch, some of the older Xboxes, those graphics will probably be very toned down. So it's going to be on your high performing computers that we really do see the strong graphics. But what I saw was beautiful. The use of light in Civilization 7 has been very particularly looked at as well. One of the themes the developers have gone for is that the areas of the map that you are exploring and have no human civilization in them are quite muted. They're quite dark. Whereas as you put cities and as you develop tiles, the map physically gets brighter. It's supposed to show that civilization brings light into the world, which was quite interesting. It did mean that the areas of the map, like now that you can see when cities are built in them, they look really bright. They look lovely. Areas of the map that hadn't been explored did look very dark. And I think this is going to be one of the biggest talking points of Civilization 7 when it comes to the actual map. I'm going to be interested to see what people think about the general art style on this one. When you look at the map at the moment and you see the general darkness of the fog of war, the choice of the grey tiles at the end of the map to represent areas you haven't discovered yet, the sort of semi-translucent grey interface, not just at the top of the map but also in the bottom right. I'll move my camera over just in the middle so you can see the sort of interface in the bottom right. And some of the menus within cities, like for instance in this city you can see the whole dialogue box in the top left. My worry is that Civ 7 might come across as being a bit dark, especially if you play in the game for a large period of time. A lot of the menus are very muted. They are very shade of grey. Certainly it is a big difference coming from Civ 6 to Civ 7. It very much is more pushing towards the Civ 5 element of monochrome. One thing that the Firaxis developers really did want to point out, and again you can see in a lot of these screenshots, is that the amount of care and detail that's been put into the regionalization of the different civs of the game is so much greater in Civ 7 than we've seen before. So you will see a lot of very different models for cities, buildings, terrain features, units, more civilization by civilization, unique flavor and look than we've seen before. So visually, the game will be very pretty. One update to the map I did want to mention was a lot of the yields on the map have been averaged and generally made to be more equitable. There are 5 different general terrains on the map: plains, grasslands, tundra, desert, and tropical, which is sort of rainforest. The base yields of all of the tiles in all of those areas has now been averaged, so there is now much less difference between starting in one area compared to another. For instance, desert now has a yield just like every other tile, and those yields are kind of split into two parts. The first half of the yield is kind of the same no matter where you are on the map. The second half is per domain or per biome. So for instance, grassland and plains represents food and production, tropical is science, tundra is culture, and desert is gold. But when I spoke to the development team behind this, the people at Firaxis, they had multiplayer in mind. They knew that a lot of the problem with multiplayer had been the averaging of starts. People do not get given an average start, so you can simply boot up a game and know, I'm not going to win this game, my start sucks compared to someone else. You re-roll and re-roll and re-roll for that exact start that you want. The idea now is that pretty much any civilization can survive in pretty much any start. Sure, there are differences with the types of yields that you might get, but there are now options in all areas. Multiplayer was in mind. Now, whether or not that balancing is going to make a difference, I don't know yet. Certainly if you're going for a scientific start and you start outside of, say, tropical with science on the map, is that going to be a problem? I don't know, but I do like the idea that unlike in Civ 6, the desert is just generally useless. Although, I guess in real life, the desert is generally useless. Where do you want to be on the realism or balance of the game? That's a question. But it all goes back to what the development team said about not wanting people to endlessly restart the game. If you find yourself pressing that restart button over and over and over and over, then a lot of the balances they've been looking to do on Civ 7, well, they haven't worked. So let's explore a little bit more into eras of the game and the crisis that have been put into the game to separate those eras out. We've already seen that there are now 3 new eras that replace the entire era system that Civ 5 and Civ 6 had before. Starting at the bottom of the wheel and going round, we have Antiquity, Exploration, and Modern. And one of the most interesting conversations I had with the Firaxis development team was this idea that came out that they want you to be able to play the game both as a campaign, which is going through all 3 ages in a single game, or to be able to play ages totally separately. So the Age of Antiquity is its own game, just like the Age of Modern would be a separate age. You can start whenever you want and you can play as many as you would like. Although I know a lot of us will still be looking to create a campaign out of the entire structure. What I do know is that eras are now designed quite intentionally to be about 150 to 200 turns each. And the game is now set to be a lot more strict about enforcing that sort of length. That means that a campaign played all the way from Antiquity to Modern will be somewhere between about 450 and 600 turns long on standard speed. Now, especially when we look at Civ 6, that is very, very different. The dev team had picked up that a lot of the, for instance, deity playing community might win the game between 225 and 275 turns on any different playstyle. And we know that some people can speedrun the game in 200 turns or less. It's possible. Civ 7 is deliberately designed to hold back that sort of progression so that one person cannot snowball and end the game that quickly. Ages are going to be much more of a physical blocker, and they're going to be used to rubber band the game a little bit to stop people from ever getting that far ahead again. And if the game does go for 450 to 600 turns, we're going to see that campaigns are a lot longer. So if you like to play a game on epic or marathon speed, you might find that this game is huge, absolutely massive. To remind as well, an age doesn't progress until all players are ready to progress, and all players progress into the new age together. So there's never going to be a stage where one civilization, for instance, moves from antiquity to exploration before anybody else. The game and the map itself is the thing that is progressing in age, and you simply sit in it. It's like everyone gets out of the car and gets into the truck. How is that going to feel? Will people feel like the rubber banding is too strict, or is it going to be a really positive step for the game? Again, time is going to tell on that one. The Antiquity age is the early game. It comprises of roughly the ancient, classical, and early medieval eras that we have seen on Civilization 5 and 6 to this point. It is also the only age that we, as people that have experienced Civ 7, have played thus far. This stage of the game is all supposed to be about starting your civilization exploration, making those first few settlements, claiming bits of the land, and getting that blueprint of what your game is going to look like going forward. You are not supposed to, at any point, pick your victory condition in the Antiquity Age. Instead, what you're doing is you're building the blocks of civilization that you are going to build on for the rest of the game. Going forward from that, exploration is effectively now the mid-game. This will represent roughly the late medieval era, the Renaissance era, and the industrial era. As you might expect, this is the first time that all of your cities will rebuild themselves. So all of your Antiquity era buildings will all reset, and the exploration era will be the first time to then build on top of these. You should note that I've mentioned era a few times. I don't know whether era and age are replaceable. Age is the technical term that we should be using here. It's in the name, exploration. This stage of the game is all about exploring the entire world and using tech to start to exploit the world at the same time. This is the first time you will find that you've got the technology to make your cities adapt to really exploit the things that you find around the world. Think colonies, think early industry, think factories, think Age of Sail. That's the sort of game we're in at the moment. Personally, I am really interested to see where that point of tech finishes. Are we going to get to steam power in exploration, or is it going to stop at the point of industrialization? We haven't really been given anything about this age. I don't know where it's going to fall into. But certainly this age is supposed to define pretty much everything from like 700-800 AD, possibly through to the Victorian ages. So this is a lot of human civilization in one age. Again, one thing you don't do, although maybe you're thinking a little bit more at this stage, is picking your victory condition. It's too early still. You are simply building a civilization that will give you the building blocks to win in the last age, which of course is the modern age. This is the final age, and this is the one that you finally pick your victory condition for the game. This is the age the game ends. It represents roughly the modern, atomic, information and future ages of the game. And it's all about redefining your entire civilization, rebuilding over everything you've done so far to pivot towards your victory condition of choice. Everything you've done to this point, it is but a base. It is but a sequence of stepping stones that you've created to then win you the game. I think we are going to expect a lot of optimization, a lot of very keen gameplay, and a lot of aggression in this stage of the game, especially people that are going for more of a domination victory. So how do we transition from one age to another? We bring in crisis, which is a very new aspect to civilization and is going to be a fundamental point that defines the end of every single age. As each age draws to the end, you can see just grayed out in this shot in the top left, there is an 80% symbol right up here. So the age is almost coming to a close. A global crisis will begin to appear. Now this crisis affects everyone on the map and it unfurls in stages. Now there is a little bit of a caveat here because I didn't get to experience the full crisis mechanics because I ran out of time during the gameplay session, but this is what I do know about them. Each crisis is developed in 3 stages. At each stage of the crisis, you, the player, pick your poison. You pick one crisis policy card that you then slot into a crisis government. Think about it as a bit of a government policy choice, but all bad. And as the crisis develops, as you can see, it begins, it intensifies, and then it accumulates into the end of the age. You pick your crisis. You develop your own worst case scenario, or whichever is the least worst case scenario for you. What I do know is that these crisis cards change depending on the civilization and the victory condition you've gone for so far. So in my roaming game, I had a lot of cards that were all about military, bandits, and owning towns that I'd conquered, and it all started to unravel very quickly. You can actually see some of these choices here, not all of them, but some of them. So for instance, 100% gold maintenance for my entire army. I started to take massive unhappiness penalties for all of my fringe towns. Everything started to unravel. The crisis is a fixed endpoint for the age, and nobody can leave until the crisis is over. Once the 3 stages have gone in, it accumulates, the world dies down, and the age progresses. It is a genuine stopping point. It is the final thing that happens in every age, and everyone goes through it. Not everyone has the same crisis, but everyone goes through it. And this is all about the sorts of lore and inspiration that the Firaxis development team had when they designed Civilization 7. The way they saw it, most civilizations that undergo that sort of rebuilding, that relayering process we were talking about with cities, well, change tended to happen quickest and most effectively once the civilization had gone through some sort of crisis, a plague, a war, a disintegration of the empire. Think of the Empire of Rome physically disintegrating, getting attacked by Vandals, retreating into what we would call the Eastern Roman Empire, where it then became Byzantium. It's crisis that caused the world to go from one age to another. And effectively, it's the crisis that is supposed to give the impression of the world resetting between ages. It's supposed to represent change, it's supposed to represent that rubber banding and that reset. And to be honest, from what I've seen so far, it seems like quite a fun mechanic and one that will give a lot of interest to the players throughout the course of the game, so that you're not just going through this pointless sort of middle and early game grind waiting for those late game decisions. How many times have I told you as a YouTuber, when you're playing Deity on Civilization 6, it doesn't really matter if you're behind, it's the last 50 turns that really matter. I'm hoping this will give importance to the early stages of the game way more than we've seen before. You never want the game to feel like it's ever petering out, or that whatever you're doing at that moment in time doesn't matter. You want your actions to give a narrative for the rest of the game, and this could be a really good way of pushing that. I also fundamentally really enjoy the idea of rebuilding over cities and changing your empire's theme from one age to another. So there's a lot that I'm very excited about, especially with the exploration and modern ages. I wish I'd been able to see those ages. I can't tell you anything about what happens at the end of the crisis or how the game unfurls into the next age. Until we see that, it's going to be about 50-50 as to whether my optimism or slight scaredness wins over on this one. My greatest worry here is that the game is going to feel a little bit rubber banded, too much. If everyone is limited to not being able to progress through the age, is there going to be enough reward for actually doing well in an age? You can see here the beginnings of the tech tree for the Age of Antiquity. Yes, it's true that every age has its own tech tree, but by about turn 135 in my playthrough, I had already hit Future Tech and Future Civic for that age. Was I going to receive a lot of benefit from having got myself into that position in the Age of Antiquity when I moved forward to exploration? I don't know. Or does the reset, is that going to be so harsh that it then makes the early game feel unnecessary? That's going to be a very difficult balancing act, and it fundamentally is going to feel very different from the Civilization experience that we've played before. You need those rewards to feel great. You need them to feel worthwhile. Otherwise, what's the point in playing well? Saying that, I think that Civ 6 has always had a bit of a problem with pacing, in the sense that districts right at the beginning of the game feel very important. The placement, those little bit of adjacency bonuses, it makes a big difference. By the time you get through to the late game, who really cares whether a harbour is +3 or +5? It's not going to matter. You just chuck stuff down. So it's always had a little bit of a pacing issue. But I'm worried whether this is going to go in the other direction. Does it make the early game unimportant and the late game very interesting? Time will tell. It's honestly very tough to give a true judgment until we see the last two ages in play. But that resetting of an age, well, that is going to be a very important mechanic, because we haven't even spoken about possibly the most fundamental change of civilization that I've ever been witness to. Changing civilizations. Yes, you did hear me right at the beginning of the video. When one age progresses to another, your civilization now changes. We have only played the Antiquity Age, but this is what we do know. You pick a civilization for the Age of Antiquity. Each civilization has a mix of unique units, improvements, and abilities that only apply for that age. When the age moves from one to the next, you pick a new civilization to play. Now, depending on which civilization you play, you always are given at least one guaranteed choice. Egypt, for instance, is an Antiquity Age civilization that is North African and has an adjacency bonus to rivers. So in any game, when the Age of Exploration happens, you will always be able to, and the example we were given was convert to Songhai, which is an Exploration Age Civ that is North African and has bonuses with rivers. However, you don't have to make that choice. You can choose any civilization you want, providing you have unlocked it using prerequisites. So again, another example we were given is if you have improved a lot of horses, you've got a lot of horses in your empire, you could become Mongolia. So the map is going to have a lot of influence as to which civilization you convert to. If you have played a particular way, you have a particular set of resources, or you've got a particular style of map, you might want to pick one civilization over another. So in theory, any civilization can become any civilization as long as you meet the prerequisites first. Although every civilization has at least one option that is historically closest. However, as you've probably gathered by now, this now means means that certain civilizations, in fact all civilizations, are now locked to the specific age that they relate to. So for instance, Egypt and Rome can only be played in the Antiquity Age. Mongolia and Songhai, for instance, can only be played in the Age of Exploration. And no doubt there will be civilizations that can only be played in the Modern Age. What these exact combinations, limitations are going to be, we just simply don't know the answer to that so far. But it does mean for the first time in civilization's history, you won't be able to play America in 4000 BC. Equally, you won't be able to run Babylon through to 2000 AD. Now, this is a fundamental change with civilization, and being absolutely honest with you, I'm still not sure how I feel about it, and I'm not sure I will know until I've played it a lot more. There are positives on the upside. On a campaign from 4000 BC through to 2000 AD, it looks like civilizations now, you can see the screen, have a lot more going on. Each civilization now has 2 unique units and 2 unique buildings. So it's gone from 1 ability in Civ 5, 2 abilities in Civ 6, 4 abilities in Civ 7. So it's getting more complicated. We also know that now you're playing 3 civilizations. That's 3 loads of unique units and unique buildings. So the customization in these games is going to be so much higher than we've seen before. That's a really good thing. I also do like the idea of changing your civilization to adapt to how you've played. One of the Firaxis development team told me very excitedly about how they had been playing a test game where they had a huge mountain start, and hint, when the age rolled over, they were able to switch to Inca, who worked really, really well in the mountains. Having that sort of adaptability to suit your playstyle and to suit the game that you're playing, that really does appeal to me. And as a content creator who is likely to spend thousands upon thousands of hours in this game, anything that gives versatility, replayability, those are the sort of things that really attract me to these sort of changes. And if you've got, say, 15 civilizations that can become 15 civilizations, which can become 15 civilizations, already the combinations there are huge. So there's a lot to be excited about. But here are some of the downsides that I'm worried about. Changing civilization from one point of the game to the other is inherently different to the civilization experience that we've seen in any game so far. Will we lose a little bit of the charm of taking a civilization from the dawn of time through to space? We can't do it anymore. The civilization will physically change under our feet. You cannot stay as the same civilization. You always change. How different and arbitrary are these civilization changes going to be? How much free will and autonomy are we actually going to have? Are we going to find that every single military game always pushes us towards Mongolia, for instance? Every single river game is Songhai. Every single mountain game is Inca. Or is there going to be a lot of flexibility between the choices? There's no point having the illusion of choice if the choice doesn't actually matter, or if you're kind of railroaded into a particular path. I think locking civilizations into ages is also quite a bold move from Firaxis here, because some people are going to want to play their favorite Civ throughout the game. You know, what if you want to play China or America from day one, from turn one? You probably can't anymore. And that is a fundamental change. People are either going to really get on board with it, or they might find it a little bit difficult to change. I can see debate on that point. You can't stress how much charm there was in being able to take any civilization through the entirety of the game. And it was so fundamental to that civilization experience that we are used to. Personally as well, I have another little worry in the back of my head, which is effectively what Firaxis have done is they've given themselves 3 times the workload, because if you want to play a game through from turn 1 right through to turn 600, you're playing 3 civilizations. That means Firaxis now need 3 times the number of civs to give you the same illusion of choice that we had in Civ 6 or Civ 5, for instance. I think I was looking back recently to Civ 6 on launch, and I think there were something like 18 to 20 civilizations when the game started. If there are 18 to 20 civilizations when Civ 7 starts, that's only 6 per age, so the choice isn't going to feel like a huge amount. But if they give 18 to 20 per age, that's almost 60 civs they've got to put into the game from day one, which is a huge undertaking. Are they going to stretch themselves too thin? Are you going to be able to have enough choice to make each individual civ worth it? I did just notice one thing though, which is the Meier civilization. I was just reading this whilst I was reading the script. Choosing an additional pantheon after unlocking mysticism. 2 pantheons! This is the sort of thing we've been screaming for years. I think I am more excited than I am worried. And if there's one thing I have to say, it's that Firaxis could have just released a very similar game to Civilization 6, 6.5, and I think it genuinely would have been received pretty well. They have gone in big on change. They have not pulled their punches. I respect that. We'll see if it's any good, but I respect that a lot. Anyone else notice this as well? This is something that is very big. You can play the same leader on different civs now. All leaders are now entirely separated out from all civilizations. There are no links between them at all. That is fundamentally different. So you could play Augustus of Rome, you could play Augustus of Egypt, you could play Augustus of England or India. The choice is yours. You can pick any leader with any civilization in that age. Massive change. Absolutely massive change. So just like in previous iterations of Civilization, leaders have their own abilities, and this is the same in Civ 7. So you can see Augustus is described as a cultural expansionist. He wants to go wide, and he wants his people to be happy and cultural about it. That's not where leaders end, however. Unlike Civilizations, leaders stay with you for the entire game, and now they level up and have their own ability tree alongside the civic and tech trees that you already have. Now, I should point out before we talk about this too much that whilst any leader can go with any civilization, there are historical combinations that are supposed to work better than others. So for instance, Augustus and his ability ties in really well with the Roman ability. And leaders and civilizations will always have more natural fits than others. So there is a historical path. But because you can play so ahistorically, and because the options are so flexible, depending on how you play, your leader will level up differently. And this is where you can see this screen. This is a shot of the leader attribute screen. As you progress through the game, through the 3 ages, your leader sticks with you the entire game. And depending on how you play, the techs you unlock, the civics you unlock, the quest system that you engage with, wonders that you build, milestones that you hit, you will unlock these attribute points. And there are 6 different trees, as you can see: cultural, diplomatic, economic, expansionist, militaristic, and scientific. Each leader has a natural affinity to one of these trees, and certain civilizations again have natural affinities to some trees. But if you play ahistorically or you play in your own way, you can go down any one of these trees that you want. And as the game continues, your leader becomes very, very specialized in whichever way you want to go. There are wildcard points as well that help you to go down any tree you want. But if you play incredibly scientifically, you'll unlock a lot of scientific points. If you play culturally and build lots of wonders, you might unlock a lot of cultural points. And thus we start to see that Augustus of Rome or Augustus of Mongolia or Augustus of France might play very, very differently from each other. And the things that you do in the first 2 ages, antiquity and exploration, will massively change your leader and your abilities in the later stages of the games. These are some of the benefits that I was talking about in terms of the things you pick up going through the game that impact the last age. So yes, there is a legacy path. This is now a game-wide set of bonuses your leader now takes with them throughout the game. I unfortunately don't have screenshots to show you of all of these trees, probably quite deliberately from the press team. But when I was looking at them, they were incredibly varied, and you can take the game wildly in different directions. There's a huge amount of personalization available to you depending on the sort of game you want to play. And again, we feed back into replayability. How organic are these choices going to be? Is there going to be one path that everyone tends to go down? Or are there going to be freedom of choice that will make this game endlessly replayable? I'm hoping for the second. Time will tell. The Firaxis team were incredibly excited about this sequence of changes, and when I was speaking to them, even when you think about the choice of leader, which civilization you're going to put, which civilization you're going to change to, and which legacy paths you want to go down as the game progresses, the options in terms of replayability are going to stretch into the billions of options. Their words, not mine. And from my perspective, this does look like an inherently replayable system. I think we're going to find ourselves in a position where everyone playing Civ 7 is going to play in an entirely different way, and there's going to be a huge amount of debate as to the meta choices, which ways you should go. We shall see. We shall see how this all pans out. But one thing did stick out to me. One of the Firaxis devs told me in confidence, and by that I mean they were very confident about what they were saying, not that it was secret, I'd point that out now. They told me that if you compare Civ 5 and Civ 6 on launch to Civ 7, 7, Civ 7 has a huge amount more content built into it than any previous civilization has before. They even went so far to say there is now more choice, more content, and more options available to you in Civ 7 than any edition of Civ with DLC put together. A bold claim, a confident claim, one I'm proud that Firaxis are making, and being honest with you, when I look at all this back, all I want to do is play more. I want to dive back into this. I want to find all of the meta abilities. I want to play Augustus of China and see which random path that I can go down. Who knows what's going to happen? I do think these changes are going to be incredibly divisive within the community, and I expect we're going to see a lot of heated debate about the merits or the failings of this particular style of play compared to previous civilizations we've seen before. For me, the biggest caveat is that we haven't seen the Age of Exploration or the modern age. So I don't know what this is going to look like going forward, but I am optimistic. Now, an interesting takeaway I took from the Firaxis presentation is that when it comes to leaders, Civilization 7 is going to steer away slightly from the previous leaders must have been a head of state of a nation before. They're looking to go away from that a little bit. We will now find ourselves in a situation where we find more economic, cultural, and scientific as well as militaristic leaders of nations as well as actual heads of state per se. And these are the leaders that I currently know about and can confirm, which isn't a lot at the moment, but these are the ones I know. We have Amina, the warrior queen of Zazu, Ashoka, world renouncer, what a cool title that is, of the Damaraja, Augustus, who was the leader I played on my gameplay, Habshepsut, which is not how you pronounce that, I don't know how to say her name, I'll learn I'm sure, whose natural civilization is of course Egypt. Confucius of China was named in the presentation, or I think it was in the presentation, or at least I heard their name mentioned in chats, but I'm pretty sure they're going to be a leader. The press pack given to us confirmed that Napoleon Bonaparte will be a leader and will be unlocked to anybody that links their 2K account to whatever platform they're playing on, a little bit like Caesar of Rome was in Civilization 6. And actually, interestingly, they've confirmed two separate personas for Napoleon as well. The Emperor persona and the Revolutionary persona. Unlocked by, the first one is just linking your Civ 7 account to 2K, and the second one is unlocked by linking both your Civ 6 and your Civ 7 account to 2K. Does this mean both forms of Napoleon are going to have totally different abilities like we saw with Black Queen Catherine and Magnificence Catherine in Civ 6, that sort of thing? I don't know. It could just be cosmetic, but those are two options available. And then of course, one more we saw confirmed, Benjamin Franklin, who I don't know what their abilities are, but he doesn't look very happy in this screenshot. So let's now talk a little bit more about tech, civics, and some of the other progression trees in the game. We've already mentioned that each age has its own tech and civic tree. The tech and civic trees, of course, are something we saw in Civ 6 and have been broadly continued. So this, for instance, is the beginning of the tech tree in the Antiquity Age. Like in previous games, the tech tree contains many of the units, improvements, and buildings that you unlock through the game. Very much scientific advancement, and research is what contributes towards that. The civic tree, just like in Civ 6, also unlocks types of government policy cards, and other empire-wide bonuses such as settlement capacity and the ability to form certain diplomatic actions. Again, a lot of what we've seen before. Each tree is accessible only in that age. When you move from one age to another, the tree disappears and you have an entirely new one. Each tree also, and again, I don't have screenshots to show this unfortunately, are ended with future civic and future tech so that there is a repeatable thing you can do if you run to the end of the tree. As you can also see, based on where this handy little pointer is on this screenshot, every civilization now has its own unique culture tree, and these are being fleshed out as we speak. These civic trees are specific to civilizations. Each civilization has one, only they can work on it, but they improve and increase the power of the unique units and improvements that that civilization can build. What has now happened is that unique units and unique improvements apply for the entire age age. So for instance, there is no such thing now as a Legion that expires when you hit man-at-arms. Legion are effective the entire Age of Antiquity. Unique units and unique improvements are way more important than before. And to help that, the unique civic tree gives you improvements on your unique things. So for instance, when I was playing Rome, I could give myself government cards that powered up my Legion, that powered up my Circus Maximus. And I really liked that. That was something really fun because you have to decide, am I going to use my culture to work on the regular civic tree, or am I going to just dip into my own personal one and improve my unique things? The choice wasn't necessarily clear. It was very interesting. You can also see now that most techs and civics have their own mastery option. So whilst the regular techs and civics progress you down the tree and unlock major milestones, so for instance, you can see with this currency, you can unlock the bath and the market, as well as the ability to put down specialists in cities. There are now also mastery options that you can undertake after picking up the base civic or tech. These improve upon the tech or civic that you have already unlocked, and they are a very good way of honing in on the specific playstyle that you want to play given the map, given the victory condition you're going for. So for instance, in my Roman game, I was going down a domination science heavy route, and a lot of the different techs, like writing for instance, but a little bit further down, you can't quite see it here, mathematics was another option. These were techs that gave me good bonuses to science. By picking up the mastery of them, I could make my science buildings even better than before, and I was unlocking these things called codexes, which are effectively great works of writing, but they gave science in my nation. I think they need to work on the balance in terms of the age and how much you can unlock, but I could see very quickly getting into a bit of a stage where I was having to decide, do I progress down the tree and unlock more and more advanced things, or do I stay on the techs and civics that I'm already on to specialize them and make sure I realize, like, hey, okay, bronze working, archers, that is really, really important because I'm going military, so maybe I want to stay a little bit longer on bronze working and make sure my archers are really good before I then go along to, say, military training. This is one of the most favorable changes they've made to the game, and I really like it. And by doing this, they've kind of retained the idea of branch techs, so techs that don't go anywhere, but they've now separated them off into these masteries so that you can just keep progressing down the tree normally in order to progress through the age without having to worry about that sort of thing. I liked this change. I'm curious to see how this one plays out. We now need to talk about legacy paths. These are the 4 paths to victory. Well, victory is a funny term because victory is only available in the last age, the modern age. Legacy paths are the things that happen in the antiquity age and the exploration age. There are now 4 victory paths in Civilization 7 on launch: science, culture, military, and economic. So no religious and no diplomatic victory paths for now. Let's see if they are added in DLC. These legacy paths double up as the victory paths for later ages, but what they do is act as effectively a milestone system, a quest system, as you were. At the beginning of the game, you pick a path that you're interested in. So when I was playing my Roman game, I picked the science path, and your science advisor comes along and says, hey, I need you to unlock writing, and gives you kind of a quest. When you do it, you get a bonus. So you can see you start to pick up things like legacy points and leader points and other bonuses that stick with you for the rest of the game. Once I'd unlocked writing, he told me to go and unlock mathematics. Then he told me to get a certain number of buildings. Then he told me to work on codexes. And eventually, if you complete the entire legacy path before the age of the antiquity finishes, you unlock a golden age and you can build the Great Library, which is a specific wonder associated with this legacy path. Permanent late game proof of your early game mastery of whatever path you were going for. And you can change from one age to another. So you can start with a really science heavy game and then swing to economic for the next age. You can see as well at the bottom, as people go through these legacy paths, you actually push the age progression forward. So if a lot of people start to go really far down these paths, the age will find itself finishing a little bit earlier. So there is a little bit of a race there. And that is all a lot to digest. This looks very different from Civilization than we've seen it before. before. There is a lot to like about this new system. We've spoken a couple of times in this video so far about aimless mid and late game turn ending. I know I want to go to space, build campuses, rush research projects. There's nothing else to really do apart from end turn, end turn, end turn. All the way through every age in every game, there is now effectively like a quest system that pushes you to do things as you go. That could give a lot of very well needed inter-age focus, something for the players to really strive for, to give bonuses that then take them to the end of the game. Certainly, I felt like it wasn't just like optimizing my empire. You had to go for these different paths, and you can go for all four of them at the same time. That's the fun thing. So I was winning military things and economic things as well as science things as I was going along. There was so much more at stake. It was so much more engaging as I was playing through those early turns. And this is another one of those reasons I think there was just so much more available content that I think Civilization 7 is going to have compared to 5 and 6. I do, however, note that this is an incredibly large departure for Firaxis from Civilization. Civ 5, Civ 6, a lot of the other Civilization games felt like you were just building an empire that made yields and tried to win the game. We've never had quests, we've never had milestones, we've never had rewards before. I don't know how divisive that's going to be to the audience. Incredibly divisive is what I predict. I think this is going to engage with a lot of debate. But if there's anything that gets added to the game that helps us to stay engaged throughout the playthrough, I am very optimistic. Again, you have to hand it to Firaxis. They have not pulled their punches here. They have jumped right in the ring and they're saying, go on then, we'll have a fight. This is not Civilization 6.5. This is something very much like Civilization 7. It was also worth pointing out as well that I think a lot of people are going to be very excited about the idea of an economic win condition, because that's something that I think a lot of people have been wanting for a long period of time. Does economic give a better sense of progression than, say, religion? Hopefully so. Religion in Civ 5 and Civ 6 felt very disconnected from the rest of the game. Economic, I don't think, is going to be as disconnected. It's also worth saying that each of these 4 legacy paths has an associated advisor. Now, in previous editions of Civilization, these advisors basically just serve as people who help with tutorial, help new players by telling them what to do. In Civilization 7, they're a little bit more useful than that. They actually act a little bit like an early warning system. So on several occasions, my military advisor came to me mid-game and said, hey, Ursa, you know your city of Cume? Did you know there is an enemy force nearby approaching your city? You should probably put some troops on the border. And lo and behold, 2 or 3 turns later, I was attacked and I went, huh. Actually, that is the most helpful advice I've ever had from an advisor. So there are some really good early warning systems, especially around crisis, that certainly the developers hinted that they were more important around that aspect of the game. Whew, huge amount to digest there. Let's give you more by talking about combat. So combat in Civ 7 looks and feels very similar to combat in Civ 6. I would say this is probably one of the base mechanics that has made its way from one generation to another. Namely, in most situations, there is 1 unit per tile, and combat is dealt with in fixed numbers with additions and subtractions of other numbers. So for instance, a warrior might have 20 strength, then you might have a couple of things influencing it that add +2 or +3 or -1. So we are not going back to the complicated percentage system of Civ 5. Specifically, when I spoke to the developers at Firaxis about this, they confirmed that the last thing they wanted to do was go back to the crazy system of Civ 5 where you'd have about 18 different multiplying aspects, just making numbers absolutely crazy. No one knew what was going on. No, that's not the case. We are sticking with solid numbers. We didn't see late into the game to confirm either way whether cores and armies and fleets and armadas and that sort of thing has retained itself into the game, but I would assume probably so. And we also mentioned it before, unique units remain relevant throughout the entire era. So a legion is going to be as useful at the beginning of the Age of Antiquity as it is towards the end, especially because the Roman civic tree gives it all of these power-ups. If you liked combat in Civ 6, Civ 7 will feel very, very similar, even down to flanking, archers firing over tiles. There is a lot of similarity. However, there is another aspect to combat that has been put in which complicates the game quite a bit, and that is the addition of commanders. There are no more great generals, now we have commanders, and in this particular screenshot you can see the Egyptian commander in the bottom right of the screen. Commanders, just like great generals, have a zone of control around them, and in that area of control, they give buffs to your units, they give penalties to enemy units, and they influence combat in various ways, depending on the way they level up. Yes, they also level up and have experience. So in this picture, we can see a Roman commander in the middle of all of its units and the commander path, progression, promotion tree, whatever you want to call it. And there's different paths: bastion, assault, logistics, maneuver, and leadership, all of which give different bonuses and influences to combat. Commanders gain experience by absorbing it from combats that happen within their area of control. So the more combat that happens around them, the more they level up. Combined with this, units themselves no longer level up. Units are just units. They fight, they have a constant combat strength, they don't get promotions like before. All of those promotions have been put onto commanders. Commanders will wildly change the effectiveness of combat in tiles surrounding them. When I spoke to the development team at Firaxis about these changes, one of the things they wanted to change from Civ 6 was the reliance on super-powered single units, like for instance melee units, that have a bunch of promotions and feel really bad when they die. Equally, units that aren't useful at all until they've had a few promotions. I mean, if you take a ranged unit like an archer or a crossbow, until it gained the first few promotions, it was losing 17 combat strength, especially with things like garrison and volley and those sort of upgrades. They wanted to make units more disposable, more replaceable, and by moving the promotions to commanders, they wanted to make sure that you had less units that you needed to worry about that actually had promotions, less things to keep safe. They also confirmed that combat is now a little bit more commander orientated. Sniping and getting a kill in combat on an enemy commander is way more important now than just blindly killing units. So if you had a sort of Napoleonic level commander, you might be able to do things on the battlefield that people just can't stop, but it might take quite a while for that commander to level up to that point. Commanders also have a bunch of other very useful abilities, and quite a few of these I think you will really enjoy. As you can see in this shot, commanders can gather the surrounding 6 tiles worth of units together into the same tile as them in order to transport them around the map. So you simply assemble units onto your commander and you just have to move your commander around the map, saving you a huge amount of clicks and times when you're trying to move a large amount of army from one place to another. I really liked that change. It was a lot of fun, especially because visually you can still see all the units and they physically walk around in a formation. It's so cool. I think I had 2 archers and 4 legion on the same commander at one point, and it looked like a massive warband approaching from one end of the map to the other. It was awesome. What you do is you bring your commander to the front line, and then like you can see in this shot, your commander then disperses the troops to the surrounding tiles, unloads them, and then starts combat. So in this way, you are going to see situations where a commander will just wander up to your borders and go bleh, and suddenly a load of units are there and you're like, where were these? I didn't see these before. Commanders can also put down fortifications just like regular units, which give you defensive advantages, and they are also able to summon to the front line distant units that are in your territory or around the map or just generally scattered around. What do I mean by this? Well, if I have a commander, say in this situation, and I'm fighting Rome, and I make reinforcements in my capital, but my capital is, say, 8 turns away. Normally, I'd have to wait for that unit to walk and walk and walk and walk, and 8 turns later, they just eventually turn up on the battlefield. Now, a commander can summon them to the front lines, and what that means is your unit will disappear totally off the map for 2 or 3 turns, and then will just reappear next to the commander, so it's not instantaneous. They do enter the void for a little bit, but they then just are useful really quickly, so this is really good for reinforcements. And again, one of the reasons why killing commanders is now going to be such an important step. Now in the long run, I don't know how balanced commanders are going to be, because I think they're going to really shake up combat. Things that I liked being able to group units into them and then move them across the map. I thought that was really handy. I thought being able to summon units from my cities was also really handy. There was one scary moment when the AI did declare war on me. I saw a commander on my border, I didn't think too much of it, and suddenly 5 warriors appeared from it and just marched into my land. That was very scary. So in the hands of the AI or a particularly nasty player, I'm not entirely sure how balanced they're going to be, but I really like some of the changes they're put in. They feel a little bit more complicated than great generals that we've seen in Civ 5 and Civ 6 before. Like everything, balance, time will tell. So if we talk a little bit now about diplomacy and influence, a lot of the yields of Civ 7 are very similar to yields we've seen in Civ 5 and Civ 6 before. Food, production, gold, science, influence culture. Even happiness is something we have seen in Civ 5. There is now a new resource called influence. You can see at the top of the screen here, there's 90 of it, and I'm gaining plus 10 per turn. Influence represents a sum total of all of the diplomatic weight that you have to deal with not only major nations, but also minor nations. You gain it every turn, you stockpile it, and you use it to perform diplomatic actions. It replaces diplomatic favor from Civ 6, but is very much more expanded. Now, this is one example of when you use it. I have just first met a civilization in this case, and you have the option to just accept the meeting and nothing happens. That's the middle option down there, the neutral greeting. Nothing happens. You just meet, everyone's happy. Or not happy. Everyone's entirely neutral about it. Or I can spend influence to influence how that greeting goes. I can either hostilely greet the AI by spending 20 influence and really reducing that relationship very quickly, or I can spend 20 influence, have a positive meeting, and in this case, reveal their capital. And it's not just on this first meet that you can do that. You spend influence to start a bunch of diplomatic interactions. So in this particular shot, I am dealing with Augustus, another AI, and I'm able to offer things like open borders, have a cultural exchange to increase both of our culture per turn, open our markets to increase the number of trade routes we can have, or even denounce him to bring down the penalty of going to war later. All of these cost influence to do. So if I don't have the influence, I can't open these sorts of dialogues. So influence limits you a little bit. You can't just open borders with everybody without being able to afford it first. Pick and choose your diplomatic interactions. Here's another example of meeting a minor nation or a city-state. I have to spend influence here to try and befriend them. Now, if I start to befriend them by spending 130 influence, it starts a timer, and at the end of the timer, they will like me enough that I will become their suzerain. Or I could try and make them incite a raid into someone nearby. Influence is going to be the catch-all currency to do a lot of those sort of actions. For instance, here you can see because I'm declaring a war and I haven't done the prerequisite denouncing, I give a bunch of influence to the person I'm declaring on because it's deemed to be a bit of an unjustified surprise war. In this shot, you can see I'm spending influence to support myself in an ongoing war, effectively inflicting war weariness on the opponent and forcing them to want to stop the war as quickly as possible. And in other options, such as things like cultural exchanges, open borders, military agreements, you have the option of just accepting what someone gives you. So I think a good example was a cultural exchange. If you just accepted it, you got a little bit of gold per turn and they got the culture. If I spend influence to support a venture that someone else puts in, we both get more culture than the agreement normally would have given. So both sides spent influence to make it bigger. Broadly speaking, I did quite like this system. It seemed to be very intuitive. There were some spying actions that you could do from early stages of the game, hostile actions that really stopped the AI. But one thing that you kept coming back to over and over was the very limited supply of influence. You couldn't do everything. You had to decide who on the map you wanted to actually put the time and effort into, and you had to decide what sort of relationship you have with people because you couldn't be everyone's friend. You had to pick and choose. Alliances seemed very strong. Denouncing people seemed very important, and making sure city-states were friendly, well, that was quite important as well. I did get the sense that this system needed fleshing out just a little bit, but given the fact that two of the names of some of the DLC that are coming out are Crossroads of the World and Right to Rule, I wouldn't be surprised if some of the economic and diplomatic aspects of the game get fleshed out in the first few DLCs pretty quickly. So I would say we're going to see a lot more in this area pretty quickly. So let's talk wonders and natural wonders. So wonders that are built by players in Civ 7 are very much like Civ 6. They occupy tiles, one per tile, and interact with districts and buildings around them. Some are new, some you've seen before, and all of them have different abilities that I think are going to be ironed out as time goes by. They weren't exactly finalized when we saw a few of them, but their abilities are going to be very varied. One interesting aspect is that most, if not all, civilizations appeared to have a linked wonder. So for instance, Rome, as you can probably tell, was the Colosseum. Egypt had pyramids, and we know a lot of other wonders in the game are probably going to give us hints at some of the civs that are in the game. Any wonder can be built by any civilization, so anyone can build the Colosseum, but the civilization linked with a wonder gets two things to help them build it first. Firstly, they tend to unlock it earlier in the tech or civic tree. So Rome, for instance, unlocks the Colosseum way before everyone else does, and civilizations tend to get a production boost towards building their wonder. Check out the description of Egypt here. 30% production towards constructing the pyramids. pyramids. So they get unlocked a little bit earlier and they're faster at building them. This kind of encourages you to build the wonder associated with your nation, but it's not going to hand it to you on a plate. You still have to actually build it. Meroya is another example, the Sanchi Stupa. 30% production unlocks it a little bit earlier. Now, one of the sneaky things I did do when I was playing, and I am kind of a little bit proud of this, is I had a little bit of a sneak peek into the Civopedia whilst I was playing, and I managed to get a list of all of the wonders that are so far listed as being in the game, which I'm going to tell you now. Remember, I think this list is probably subject to change, but it goes a little like this. So you can see now on the screen the list of the wonders I managed to pull from the Civopedia. Quite a few of these we've seen before. Petra is back, Colossus, Colosseum, Pyramids, Hanging Gardens, but there's also other stuff. Nalanda, the Theodoric Mausoleum, the Great Steel, there's a lot of stuff. And if my suspicions are correct, a lot of these wonders are going to be linked to civilizations, so this probably gives us a little bit of a hint about the sort of civilizations we can see and expect in Civ 7. Terracotta Army, is China going to be in? I mean, China is obviously going to be in the game. It just sort of gives you a little bit of an impression. One little shocking fact for you, and I know this will be a controversial thing, because desert tiles have been balanced a little bit more now and they're actually useful to work, Petra no longer gives food to desert tiles. It does still give a lot of production in gold, but it doesn't give food anymore. What are we going to do without Petra? I'm sure we'll be fine. I also got a little bit of a sneak peek about the natural wonders in the game. So unfortunately, the Civopedia, just like for the wonders, gave no information as to what all of these wonders did. But here's the list of natural wonders. They seem to at least provide a lot of happiness. I'm sure there are other benefits. I didn't start next to one. I didn't get to settle it and see what it did, but there we go. Again, does this give us a sort of hint about the sort of civilizations in the game? I'm not sure, but some we recognize, some we don't. Now in this last stage of the video, I am going to just go through a lot of the other notes of little minor points that I found that necessarily don't make themselves into whole sections of this video. So this is going to be quick fire. This is just stuff that I picked up. Independent powers. Now we saw a shot of these earlier. These effectively have replaced city-states and barbarians. That's right, barbarians are no longer in Civ 7. It's all independent powers. There's a whole bunch of powers. Some start with very positive relations, some start with negative relations. So I started next to two on my playthrough. One was really friendly and I was able to suzerain it. The other one was entirely aggressive and raided me repeatedly, pretty much just like barbarians do. So I think they've kind of taken a lesson from city-states in Civ 6 and then also the Barb clans, and they fleshed them out to be these more complicated entities. I spoke to somebody in Firaxis, one of the devs, about this, and they did mention that it was an interesting progression. Potentially in 2025, the word barbarian and the aspect of what a barbarian is to different civilizations changes, right? Are barbarians locals? Are they natives? Are they genuine rebels? Who knows what they are? They're different to different people. They wanted to make them more complicated and fleshed out, and I think these independent nations were the way of doing it. They didn't seem to be entirely complicated in what you could do with them, but it's a start. And I did note that when you suzerained an independent nation, you could pick which suzerain bonus you wanted to take from that relationship. So they're incredibly flexible to a point. I think that relationship also evolves with time and they become more and more useful. I'm looking forward to seeing this situation and this system play out a little bit more. Now, scouts are broadly similar to what you've seen in Civ 5 and Civ 6, but they have one additional ability now, which is really interesting. You can spend the turn surveying the land around you instead of moving. When you do this, your line of sight increases a little bit, but I think it was within a 6-tile radius. You actually identified points of interest on the map, natural wonders, tribal villages, useful things like that. So you could kind of pre-scout with your scouts, find the areas you wanted to go to, and then beeline them with the movement next. I really liked that. It was actually a nice little ability, and it gave scouts more of a use. It let you survey the land much quicker and then go towards the points of interest that would benefit you. They are still, however, mega fragile, and I got a couple killed. Although, interestingly, when one of my scouts got killed, I got an event, a story event in my city that let me honor their passing in different ways. I could get angry and I got production towards making making more scouts and army, or I could get science and culture and learn from my mistakes. It was really interesting, actually. So I think we're going to see scouts as a much more expansive system. Equally, tribal villages now provide options of benefits. This reminds me a little bit more of the Shoshone, easy for me to say, nation from Civ 5, where you got to pick which tribal village or goodie hut benefit you got. You can do that now in Civ 6. You get at least a couple of options. I really like that as a change. It's really handy, especially early game, because you can say, no, gold is more useful than science, or I'd like more culture, I want more happiness, whatever it is. And we've mentioned happiness a couple of times. One thing that happiness does do, just like in Civ 5, is your excess happiness pulls up and collects into triggering a celebration, or a golden age as we would normally have called it. Depending on which government you've picked, you get a different celebration bonus. So for instance, in my game, I went for despotism. When I celebrated, I got a huge science boost and a production boost towards armed units. But say I'd gone classical republic or oligarchy, I could have got a different bonus. So I think this is the bonus associated with keeping small, keeping tall, and staying happy. You get to pick your golden age bonus. I should point out as well, which was quite funny, when I went into a celebration, because I was a despot, I got a happy little announcement saying, "We love the despot day has started." And I was like, how dare you? I'm a lovely person. I'm not a despot. I'm wonderful. And then I realized I was killing people, and I was like, yeah, fair. I don't think different governments change too much in terms of which policy cards you can put into your government, but if you liked the Civ 5 system, there's a lot to like about this one. Speaking of governments, social policies remain pretty much broadly the same as before. You can pick which government policies you want in your government, so you could get more production or food or culture, whatever it is, and you can chop and change as you unlock civics. That's very much like the Civ 6 system, with one big difference. It appears now like your government only has wild cards, and all social policies are available to be put into any of your governments. The governments are way more flexible than before. At the beginning of the game, my government started with like 2 choices, but by the time I'd hit Future Civic, I had 7 choices, and you now have civilization-specific policies you can put in. So for instance, I had one that made my legion more powerful for every unique room and building I'd built. That was quite good. It made legion hit like trucks. Like they were blowing things out of the water. It was so much fun. I felt so Roman. We can quickly talk about the additions of the game that have been announced as well. The standard edition of Civ 7 will be $70 at launch, or $60 if you play on Switch. The deluxe edition will be $100 or $90 on Switch. What do you get in the deluxe edition? Well, you get the game, you get the ability to pre-play the game from the 6th of February, so it's 5 days earlier, and you get the Tecumseh and Swansea pack. I'm really sorry, my pronunciation is really bad on that, but I think that's a new leader and a new civilization. And when it's released, you also get the DLC Crossroads of the World, as well as the deluxe content pack. I don't know what that is. So effectively, you're prepaying for a little bit of DLC, and you're probably getting some cosmetic packs on top of that. I don't know if that leader and civilization will get put into the game eventually, a little bit like with Civilization 6, Montezuma was eventually put into the game after being separate on launch. Who knows? There's also the Founders Edition for $130 or $120 on Switch. That gives you everything in the deluxe edition, but also the second DLC when it launches called The Right to Rule, and the Founders Content Pack. Again, I don't know what that is. That can only be bought up until the end of February. Once that disappears, in theory, the pack disappears. I wish I knew about the exact contents of the packs a little bit more. Unfortunately, that's all the information I have. Some of the packs are incredibly expensive, and I invite you, audience, to think about the pros and cons of spending money on editions of the game, prepaying for DLC that hasn't yet been announced or released. Whether you want to do that is up to you. The standard edition price doesn't appear to be too out of kilter with other major releases. I think that's probably within acceptable range. And if you own a Switch, everything is $10 cheaper. Huzzah for you. I mean, I'd be surprised if the Switch can play it, but huzzah for you. My final thoughts. Firaxis have made a new game. This is a new game. It is a true evolution. It could not have more change. Are some of the changes bad? Possibly. Are some of the changes good? Absolutely. Will the game take a long time to blood out? Well, actually, if we look at other releases like Civ 5 and Civ 6, it wasn't until months of balances, patches, DLC. I mean, can we really say that Civ 5 was a good game before Brave New World? Can we really say that Civ 6 really had been fleshed out until Gathering Storm? It might take a little bit of time for Civilization to get itself going. I really do think the amount of change here is substantial. And And with that will come balancing issues. I also think that one of the major concerns and reservations a lot of people are going to have about this game is the sheer quantity of change. Change is the buzzword, and if there's one thing I've learned about the internet is that people do not like change. But Civilization means so much to me personally. Not only is it the game I have by far spent the most amount of time in, Civ 6, I now have more than 7,000 hours in the game. That is an obscene amount of time. It is literally my job to play this game. I could not feel more connected to it. I traveled for 24 hours in both directions to go to Baltimore with other content creators just to see this game. Isn't this a lovely picture, by the way? I've got all kinds of pictures from the trip. I haven't really deluged this video too much with this sort of thing because I just thought it would go on for far too long. So maybe, you know, come around to the live streams. But this game means so much to me. So much to me. And you know what? I'm actually really optimistic. I really am optimistic. Almost as optimistic as I was when I saw this statue. Look at that butt. And a machine that has champagne. And America, what the hell have you done to tea? This is a travesty. But I am really optimistic. I genuinely think the skeleton of the game that I played, it was really fun. I just want to play more. And if that reaction gives me an accurate representation of how Civ 7 is going to be received and how it's going to play, I'm really happy. I dread to think how long this video has been going on for. Thank you for sticking with me. My aim here was just to deluge you with everything that I could think of about Civ 7 that I know. But I really hope you enjoyed it. If you could like it and subscribe, I will genuinely have a lot of Civ 7 users coming out. I really hope I'm a really reliable source of information with fair analysis on these things. So if you want to subscribe as Civ 7 information comes out, that would be awesome. If you want to know more, I will be lurking in the comments, so you can feel free to ask me anything in the comments. I'll try and answer more reliably. Come along to the Ursa Discord. There is a whole host of, as I say, about 19,000 people in there. And I'm sure we'll be talking all about this information about Civ 7. Pop it down. I'll try and answer as many questions as I can. I'm also going to be live streaming a lot over the next few weeks and months, including the day after this video goes out. I'll be live. Come and chat to me. I will run it as a little bit of an ask me anything. Ask me anything I know. If I know the answer and I'm allowed to tell you, which in most cases I will be able to tell you, I will let you know. So think of all your questions. We'll do what we can. I've been Ursa. I now need to go and lie down. See you in the next video.